I first learned about Bitcoin back in 2013, and this is before the word blockchain had entered the vernacular. There was only this one asset, Bitcoin, and I think like a lot of people, I was interested in it because I heard how much it was going up in value or how volatile it was. And at the time, I was working in capital markets, an investment banking role, and we were interested in understanding this asset a little bit better. So I spent some time looking into it, and the more I looked into it, the more convinced I became that there was more to the story than just a single asset, that this wasn't only about speculation, or really that it wasn't even really about money, that this was a potentially new general purpose technology that could have broad implications for finance and other industries. What I kind of figured out was that blockchain technology, the thing that makes Bitcoin possible, was basically the first digital medium for value, a way to move money or assets peer to peer between different people or different businesses without the need for an intermediary. In the same way that the internet was kind of the first digital medium for information, a way to move information between people without the need for, a middleman like a traditional media company or the post office or something. And so the thinking was, well, if the first era of the internet was the internet of information, perhaps blockchain was ushering in a new internet, an internet of value or an internet of assets. And with that initial thread, I kept pulling and pulling and pulling, and eventually went all in on this topic. The origin story of Bitcoin was that it was born in the aftermath of the great financial crisis. And during the great financial crisis, we saw the risk of too much power and influence being concentrated in the hands of a handful of big companies. And there was a concern that government bailouts of big banks was creating this moral hazard where basically big companies could go and gamble with shareholder and customer assets, and in the end they wouldn't be forced to suffer the consequences if something went wrong. What Bitcoin offered was something very different, a way to move and store value that was not controlled at all by a company or a government, that was governed by code and that was decentralized in a way that didn't allow power to get concentrated in the hands of any single entity. And that was a very appealing idea for me. But the bigger idea was really the notion that if blockchains could work for Bitcoin as a way to move money, in this case Bitcoin, between two people, that it might be programmed to do the same thing for other kinds of assets. Because it turns out that assets in the economy require scarcity to have value, right? If I send you 20 bucks, it's important that I can't send the same $20 to somebody else. And that's true for other things. If I sell you a share of Apple, it's important that I can't sell the exact same share to someone else. Because if I can copy money, or in this case, shares of a company, in the same way that the internet allows me to copy information, then those assets become worthless. And this is a very specific thing called the double spend problem that Bitcoin sought to solve. How do you ensure that when you move something of value between one person and another, that you can't do the same transaction again? That there isn't a digital trail of breadcrumbs. And it was really Satoshi who solved the double spend problem, the Satoshi being the creator of Bitcoin, through this ingenious thing called a blockchain. And a blockchain, I think most people hear the word, but maybe not everyone understands what it is. A blockchain is basically a decentralized ledger of transactions. So all the transactions that are happening inside of a network like Bitcoin are basically batched and stored periodically in this ledger. Everyone can see what's in the ledger. Everyone can verify that it's accurate, but no single person can change the results. Like a central bank can't print more Bitcoin, right? Or a company can't say that there's more shares than there were before. So the only way that the network, that new things get added to the ledger is if the whole network reaches consensus. So the idea is that this is a new trustless platform for the movement and storage of money. So when I send you Bitcoin, you know that you have the only one because you can see that my wallet has been debited and yours has been credited. Everyone can access this, right? And that's a very powerful concept that turns out can apply to every single asset in the economy. Money, stocks and bonds, titles and deeds to property, currencies, art and IP, scientific discoveries, even votes in an election. Some of the really interesting examples of blockchain is in voting, where if I vote, it's important that when I cast a vote, that it's cast and counted, that I can't vote again, right? I can't spend the same vote twice, and that I can verify the results while remaining private. just like a transaction. So that's the idea with this technology. Yes, decentralization is important, but it's the notion that it can be programmed to do anything that made it so exciting for me. When I first got into this, the value of all digital assets was mostly in Bitcoin. And the value was around $5 billion in size. So if Bitcoin had been a publicly traded company, it would be considered like a small cap company at the time, maybe small to mid cap company. Wouldn't have really registered, right, in the eyes of most investors. And today, the value of this asset class is around $2.5 to $3 trillion. And so in that sense, it has succeeded in that it has grown hundreds of fold over a decade to become an asset that rivals other kinds of assets in the economy. And in other ways, it's succeeded too. So the thesis that blockchain could be a platform for moving other kinds of assets and storing assets and programming assets actually turned out to be very true. In terms of decentralization and the promise of blockchain as something that was going to disrupt existing power structures, I think the jury is still out. I mean, my answer is revealing in a way. I'm talking about big companies that are adopting this technology, which if you'd asked the Bitcoin true believers 10 or 15 years ago, to them, that may not have been the sign of success. The sign of success would have been, we don't need those guys to validate what we're doing because we're doing something different that is starting to really shake the windows and rattle the walls of Wall Street. So I think that it's an interesting question where in some respects it is answered to the affirmative. Yes, this has been disruptive. The adoption is real. The technology is changing how we do business and how we do finance. On the other hand, we still have all the same kinds of companies and governments and so forth that we used to have. And maybe that's not a sign of failure, but rather just a reality of when a technology matures and it becomes useful, big companies are going to want to use it. Because either A, it could help them do things that they couldn't do before, enter new markets, offer new products and services, or it's a real threat and they have to adopt or die. I actually take a completely different point of view on that question, which is I actually think that Bitcoin and crypto more generally may be the last time that retail investors can participate in the full upside of a growth opportunity. So I'll give you an example. When Amazon went public in the 90s, its market cap was in the hundreds of millions of dollars. When Google went public in 2004, I think it was, a few $billion. So a DIY investor could have bought the IPO in either of those stocks, and if they had the stomach to see it through, would have generated 50, 100, 500x returns, right? And that would have been a life-changing investment for them. Today, SpaceX goes public at $2 trillion, right? So they're not really leaving a lot of meat on the table for retail investors. A lot of the value creation that's happened in those companies has occurred before they're widely available to retail investors. So now maybe things change. Maybe private markets open up so that retail investors can participate in secondaries and get in early stage into venture capital. But this idea that you as a DIY investor, can identify a company and generate huge kinds of returns seems to be rarer and rarer. Okay, so what about crypto? Well, crypto is actually the opposite. For 10 years, institutional investors ignored crypto, and Bitcoin was something anyone could buy. Obviously, in the very, very, very early days, it was this kind of technical thing, and you had to have some know-how. But as early as 2010, 2011, there were exchanges where an individual investor could spend $5,000 or $500 buying some Bitcoin. And had they done that, they would have done extremely well. The Ethereum fundraising event, which is the thing that helped to launch Ethereum, they raised $20 million. There were definitely some high net worth individuals and whales close to the project who kicked in a lot of money, but there were mostly just retail investors that invested in it. So I actually think in a way, Ethereum and Bitcoin and these other projects are not abnormalities. If anything, they're kind of part of this longer tradition of retail being able to get in early, which I now fear is no longer the case. I think that we're entering a new digital era, right? A second digital era. So the first digital era was defined by the invention of the computer, the microprocessor, but also the internet, and also mobility, and also interactive entertainment, video games, all these different things. And maybe in the 1970s or 80s, people would have thought these are all distinct areas. There's computers, which are used by enterprises, then there's these little video game consoles like Atari. Well, those are for the consumer market. And then there's this internet. At the time it was called the ARPANET. Well, that's used by academics and scientists. It's not like really related, right? And mobility, well, you have to have 15 grand to have a cell phone. So maybe that's for the executive class. But what ended up happening is that all these different technologies collapsed in on each other, right? They were not separate, they were related. And they were on a convergence course where today you use the internet on a smartphone, which is a computer, connected to GPS, which was a government system that allows you to access software and applications, which used to be a separate thing. So the first digital age had several technologies which converged together in a way that created an end product that was more powerful and more important than the individual parts. So where are we today? Well, there's a new set of technologies that are emerging that are not the same as the last, right? And the most important technologies of this new digital age are AI, obviously, blockchains, robotics, and what I would describe as the Internet of Things, right? Which is an old term, but a useful one nonetheless. So the way that my partner actually at CMCC talks about it, he says, think about it like the human body, right? Where you've got the muscles of the body, the bones of the body, that's robotics. The brain of the body, that's AI. And then the nervous system, the thing that regulates the flow of information and value and allows the whole thing to function, that's kind of like blockchain, right? That's the way in which things get regulated and metered out so that things can function properly. I think it's a really interesting kind of analogy. But the idea is that these things are converging, right? That they're not separate. And they're definitely not in competition. Everyone's really excited about agents, right? Not Asians, agents, like secret agents. And agents, basically the idea that you have software that can perform all of these important kind of tasks in the economy, that they can reason through problems and achieve objectives, kind of like a person, right? So you can have an agent, advertising executive, an agent lawyer, an agent doctor, and so on and so forth. We're not there yet on some of those professions, but we're moving in that direction. So it's very likely that agents will eventually start to get paid for their services. Agents will need a way to transact and to do business. But there's a problem. They can't open a bank account. They can't send a wire. They can't incorporate a company. They can't buy an insurance policy. They can't sue in court because they're not a person. They don't have legal standing. And if you don't have legal standing, then you can't access the same kinds of things that people can access. Now, maybe we end up in a scenario where AI agents are given personhood, which sounds insane, but it's not. We gave corporations personhood. A corporation is a legal fiction, and AI is a technology fiction, right? So it's possible, and even Javier Milei, the president of Argentina, has introduced a law to give agents personhood. But anyway, we'll park that for a second. Until that happens, and even still if it does, I think agents, because they're software, will want to be able to do business and transact using a digitally native toolkit, right? They'll want a way to move and store value, enter into binding agreements, to invest, to be able to resolve conflicts in a way that's purely digital. So they can't open a bank account, but they can have a wallet. They can't send a wire, but they can send a stable coin. They can't sign a legal agreement, but they can sign a smart contract, right? Self-executing code that allows for value to be moved between parties. And eventually, they can't sue, but there are conflict resolutions that can happen on-chain, meaning in this whole ecosystem, that may allow them to reconcile when something goes wrong. So that's the idea, that the AI age needs a AI and digitally native way to do business. And so that's the opportunity. And this is already happening. Companies like Circle, for example, which is the issuer of the second largest stablecoin, have built a blockchain arc and have found that it's being chosen by agents that are now just operating on behalf of people to do business. Because why would you want to use the analog system when something better exists? The DIY is not really doing it themselves. It's not do it yourself. It's do it with AI, right? Do it yourself with AI. And I think that that's something that I think should make them feel empowered. On the other hand, if you may indulge me, I think I read recently that the percentage of trades done by DIY investors today is the highest that it's been since the late 1990s. A lot of people see markets going up and are piling into these markets. And I think if you're a new investor to the market and you don't have the experience of seeing downturns and managing risk, that you can very quickly find yourself in a position where you stand to lose a lot of money. So there is obviously a lot of value and benefit to having some experience. Sometimes the best decision is no decision in life and in investing. And I think probably DIY investors churn their portfolio way too much, generally underperform the index. And a lot of that has to do with the impatience that comes with watching numbers on a screen. So sometimes the best decision is no decision. Maybe an AI can act like a psychologist more than anything and say, like, take a beat, go for a walk, kiss your kids, touch grass, don't do anything. You might end up better for it. The only thing more important than being early is sizing your position appropriately. So this is something that I think a lot of DIY investors, make the mistake in. They've got so high conviction on something, and then they put like 1% of their portfolio into their super duper high conviction idea, and then it triples. But what did that do to the whole pie, right? So sizing is important. This is not, the advice here is not YOLO into a single stock or something. I'm just saying that is a classic mistake that I think a lot of people make. And that's something that portfolio managers do, I think, a lot better, which is that they size positions, and so they really construct it in a way that gives you exposure to the thing they want to do. I think at the beginning I talked about the convergence of these different technologies, and we talked a lot about AI and blockchain, but we didn't talk as much about all that other stuff, right? I think I mentioned the Internet of Things and robotics. So I think it's worth spending a moment on that because, again, it's an example of convergence. It's very likely that in the next little while we'll have way more internet-connected devices and eventually robots and autonomous cars and so forth than there are people using the web, right? So the internet will be really for machines more than it is for people. And so those machines are going to need a way to think and reason through problems, and that's why they all have AI built into them. And you don't want a robot that can't think. What's the point of that? But they're also going to need a way to do business and to transact and to interact in the world. So, if you're, there's a sort of fun thought experiment, like we all know about Waymos, right? Self-driving cars, but they're owned by Waymo, the company. So when you drive in a Waymo and you make a payment, the money goes to Waymo. But is there any way that a car could own itself? Like rather than Waymo owning the car, could the car be autonomous? Could it be emancipated? And if it were, could it also be a money-making operation where it has a crypto wallet that accepts payments in stable coins and the car becomes an autonomous sovereign economic unit like a company? And could that car and other cars band together and create a car-owned version of Waymo that competed directly against the human-owned version? Anyway, so that's the kind of stuff that I think about when I can't fall asleep at night.